Experiential Spirituality, episode 35, Pure Poetry. As ever, you can find a link to my Twitter account through a link in the description box below. You can find a link to my book in the description box below, and you can ask me anything through Curious Cat via a link in the description box below. Now, last week I read the first draft of a poem I'd written about the cat Seath, the ghost cats of the Scottish Highlands. It's actually a Celtic myth. They're spoken of in Ireland as well. But this poem was specifically about my home county of Caithness, the name of which is derived from a Pictish tribe that once lived here. They were the tribe of Cait. They belonged to the kingdom of Cait. And when the Norsemen first encountered this place, they called it Catness, land of the cat people, based on those Picts. Now, we don't know too much about those Picts. We don't know too much about the Picts broadly, but we know they venerated cats. There were lynx in this land at that time, and it's possible that they used the lynx's body parts, to adorn themselves. You might have seen, for example, Roman soldiers wearing bear helms and things like that. All kinds of cultures did that. So we know that these Picts venerated cats of various kinds. We just don't know the specifics of that. And of course, over the centuries, there grew this legend of the cat Seath. Now, Seath, and I don't speak Gaelic, so I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. It could be she, it could be Seat, but I think it's Seath. The cat Seath is a legend that came about of phantom cats, essentially. You see, Seath in Gaelic refers to what they would call a fairy, and that could be many things, but a fairy is essentially a phantom. So whenever you hear Celtic stories of fairies, they're really talking about phantoms of various kinds. And so that's what my poem was about. Now, when I read the first draft of this poem, I explained that I had taken some dramatic license in places. There were some things I said in that poem that may not have been strictly true to history. But I finished the poem now, the final version is complete, and there's no such dramatic license in it now. The narrative is now far more focused, the order of things is far more logical, and it conveys nothing but straight history, factual history, and I'm really happy with what I've done with this poem. As I said, it's not a very sophisticated poem. I like poems that rhyme, so this is a poem that's written in the fashion of an old school children's rhyme. Very simple, straightforward poem with a very easy rhythm to get into. So I'm going to read you the final draft of my poem now, and I can tell you it's the final draft for sure, because as much as I'm one of those individuals who could go back and tinker with my creative works endlessly, I'm just one of those people. And I think it was George Lucas that says that he was speaking about film specifically. He said a film is never really finished. I think many creative individuals feel that way, and they're always tempted to go back and tinker with their works. But for me, when it comes to writing poetry, when it comes to writing prose, like my old novellas and things like that, for me there's a window in which I have to do those things, and after a certain point, it is what it is, and what I've created is perfect. Not in the sense that it's necessarily a masterpiece, but it's perfect in the sense that it's what it was meant to be, complete with whatever flaws might remain. So I don't claim this to be a perfect poem, I don't claim it to be a masterpiece, but I can safely say it is what it was meant to be. So I'm going to do my best to read this poem to you as effectively as possible, not mispronouncing anything, not getting tongue-tied or anything like that. And as before, I'm not going to put it on screen, because I don't want anyone reading ahead. I want, because poetry was intended as an oral form of communication, so it's best if I just read it without showing you on screen. Okay, just take a drink. And you can see how radically it's changed. A lot of the verses are still the same, but a lot of them have been reordered, and I'd say about 50% of this poem is different from what it was last week. So the poem is called Caithness, Throne of the Fairy Cat. At the north of Scotland there can be found this mist-shrouded land of river and mound, once home to the people of bronze and woad, the realm untouched by the Roman road. For upon this land were the Picts of Kate, to the northern isles their kingdom a gate. Yet among this tribe a curious thing, a love of felines of which they would sing. And at that time the lynx did roam, chief among cats in their rugged home. The Gaels from Ireland soon carved out a spot in this savage land where Romans could not. Then Norsemen came from their distant shores to settle its river and to hunt its boars. But every name by which this land was known referred to its place as a feline throne. Now over time those peoples became a single people with a single name. Wedded they were as the Highland Scot, but of former times not many forgot. The mighty lynx once worshipped and feared was hunted to extinction and all their dens cleared. Yet across the moors wild cats still stalked, and of fairy felines the people now talked. But of these cat seath nobody knew if they were phantoms or witches or something anew. They are black with white chests, the people then said. They steal the souls from the newly dead. Should you meet one, then best run and hide, for ill fortunes shall stalk you from every side. Tim Taldrum and Tom Tildrum were among their kings, and the demonic big ears a grim ritual brings. But those days are gone and most have forgot those fearful old stories once recounted a lot. In Caithness now the only felines most see are domestic cats and those roaming free. What reason to dread the phantom or witch when we have every comfort at the flick of a switch? Yet farmers still tell their stories of fright, of livestock and deer slaughtered by night. Killed by great cats, those farmers will say, seen in the darkness and sometimes the day. But such accounts are no mystery to me, for I have seen ghostly felines as high as my knee. I also know well those tales of yore, tales of old Tom, and other such lore. So should you wander this haunted place, fear the cat seath and the fairy race. So that's the poem in its final form, and as I said, I'm very happy with it. One thing that's kind of tricky when you're evoking real history and real mythology is that you have to deal with what the mythology is and what the history is, and this is true when you're using names as well. So these verses are kind of tricky. Tim Taldrum and Tom Tildrum were among their kings, and the demonic big ears a grim ritual brings. See, those names, Tim Taldrum, Tom Tildrum, and Big Ears, you know, they're kind of silly names, but those are the actual names from a 19th century account of the cat Seath, and so that's the genuine names. I had to put them in the poem and make sure they worked in the poem. And obviously the poem doesn't go into the ritual to summon this demonic cat Big Ears, but what it basically involved was, for some reason, burning a number of cats over a period of nights, and somehow that would evoke this demonic Big Ears. And so that's the poem. I'm very happy with it, and yeah, it is what it's meant to be. It lays out everything. I mean, it's a poem that delivers information, a lot of information that essentially contains everything you need to know about the history of cats, the history of Caithness as far as cats is concerned, and the legend of the cat Seath. That poem tells it all, and so it was written as an informative poem, and accomplishes that very well. So, you know, because I like to write with pen and paper rather than on my computer, you know, I've got a notepad and I've got all kinds of poems planned in the future. I've written all kinds of notes here. So here's some poems that I will be doing. I don't know exactly what order I'm going to do them in yet, but I want to write a poem about what the Gnostics called a Heilig, the state of the Heilig. I think it's very relevant at the moment because of what we see going on around the world, and we see what are now known as NPCs just going along with all of it, not seeing the obvious. And so I think a poem about the state of the Heilig is very relevant. I think I'm going to prioritize this poem about endurance because, you know, a lot of people who don't have the kind of spiritual understandings that we talk about in this live stream, they're really struggling with the state of the world as it is just now. And every day they wake up when there's a new authoritarian step being taken, and they feel powerless and they feel hopeless. So I think a poem about enduring, essentially, and living through times like this would be very helpful. And that's one thing I think you've always got to ask yourself, whenever you're doing a creative or productive work, there's all kinds of questions you can ask yourself, but I think probably the most important is what you're doing useful? So when I was writing that poem about the cat's teeth, is it useful? Yes, because it's informative. And hopefully, I can write poetry that helps to inform, including spiritual poetry, because one thing I'm never doing is omitting God. Because I've written out the first draft of this poem about endurance, and I could easily have written it without mentioning God at all. It could just be a secular message about staying strong through these times. But no, I make sure always to bring God into it and to make clear how central God is to everything. There's a poem I'm writing about God, and as I said last week, mystics have always used many mystics throughout history, famously Rumi, they've used poetry to talk about God and to talk about spiritual experiences, because poetry, like music, it kind of enables you to transcend language, which is very useful when you're talking about that which transcends all concept and all language anyway, namely the spiritual. I want to write a poem about hell and why it's a good thing. I've said this recently that many individuals who have a spiritual perspective or who are religious, they're very timid about the subject of hell because they feel it's an uncomfortable subject they don't want to address. They feel it puts them in a difficult spot. But it's the furthest thing from the truth. There are hellish realms that souls go to after the death of their physical form. Now, unlike mainstream Christianity, unlike what mainstream Christianity believes, no soul resides in hell for eternity. It's more, these forms of hell are more akin to the Catholic purgatory in that they exist to redeem souls who have fallen to a very low state of consciousness, to a very egoic state in their mortal form. And the thing about hell, whatever you believe about the specifics of hell, is that it can only be a good thing because it's there because God created it. So I'm not one who shies away from the reality of hell and the fact that billions of souls will ultimately go there. Most souls will ultimately go to some form of hell, a form of hell that's appropriate for them. I don't shy away from that, and every day I'm grateful for that. It's difficult for me to understand how anyone who's in touch with their conscience can look at the world around them and the way that certain souls behave and not be grateful for the reality of hell. So that's what this poem is about. Another poem I'm writing is one about bereavement, which I think is always going to be relevant. And also I want to write some sword and sorcery flash fiction as well. I talked a bit about that last week. It's kind of challenging to do that. It's more challenging to do that than to write a poem, for me at least, to write a piece of prose that's less than 1,000 words and have it convey so much. That's a challenge that I'm looking forward to. So there's my first draft of the... Okay, this is a poem. This is probably the poem I am going to write first because it's relevant to me. And this is something incredibly I haven't talked about in the last 15 years here on YouTube. I did tweet about it last night, but I removed the tweet because it's not the kind of thing that can be explained in a single tweet. And I'm not a person who likes to do tweet threads. If I've got something to say, it either fits in one tweet or I don't say it at all. And like whenever I see someone on Twitter, they've posted like a tweet and then there's like 50 tweets following it, I'm just not going to go through that. There are other formats that are better, more appropriate for that kind of message. So, as you all know, I grew up with cats. I have a very strong affinity with cats because my mum and my stepdad, when I was growing up, and they still do, they always took in stray cats, they took in wounded cats, they took in cats that had no home. So I grew up with an enormous amount of cats, an enormous amount. And I can safely say that every single one of them had the best life possible. I love my cats and they love me. It's why, when this cat showed up at my door recently, it instantly took a liking to me, and I was very happy here and didn't want to leave here. As I said last week, when it comes to competing for the affections of a cat, no one really has a chance against me because they just naturally like me. And there's so much about cats in my life. The fact that I was born and I grew up and I still live in Caithness, the home of the cat. Cats are very important to me. I have a friend who I haven't talked about in a long time, but his family motto is "Touch not this cat." That's how ingrained cats are to this place and to this culture up here. Even though most people around here are completely unaware of it because they're completely detached from their past and from those traditions. So every one of the cats that I grew up with had a great home and had a great life and died of extreme old age, except for one. The very first cat I had was a cat called Levi, and it had a great life. It was eventually hit by a car. And then later on, when I was about 9 years old, I had another cat, and it looked just like Levi, so we called it Levi the Second. And one day, Levi the Second just disappeared. And sorry, I hate to get emotional, but what I didn't know, what nobody knew in my family at the time, was that my sister had a boyfriend. Now, at that time, and he didn't like that cat. Look, I can't go into the details, but the basic premise is basic point is we found out years later that he was essentially torturing that cat. And it seems, we can't know anything for sure, but it seems that the cat didn't just disappear to go to a new home. And from my perspective, why would it? Because I said all our cats were treated like royalty. No, it seems he might have killed it. And I find it very... Obviously, as a 9-year-old, I had no conception of what was going on. Neither did the adults around me. And so it's one of those things where you look back and you were powerless to do anything. And, I'm talking about a cat here. And so it makes me think, when I think about that, when I think that I had no idea of the suffering that cat endured, and I have to live with the fact that I don't know what happened to it. Did it suffer a quick death or not? I don't know. It's that uncertainty that is the issue. And I think about that, and this is what I said on Twitter last night, is that I briefly conveyed that story, and I said, I'm talking about a cat as well. I can't imagine what it must be like for those people who have lost, say, a child to some kind of child predator or something like that. I can't, to live with that is on a different level altogether. And the reason this came to my mind is because of this cat that showed up at my door, and because of all the cat-related things that have been going on. And it is one of the most, maybe some people watching won't understand. I said this to my driving instructor the other day, because I was telling her about this cat that was showing up at my door. And, I'll say anything to this driving instructor. So I'm talking to her about these ghost cats, I'm talking to her about Jesus and everything. And she said something that kind of called into question, why I would care so much about this cat. And I said to her, look, Jesus said, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And as far as I'm concerned, that applies every bit as much to animals as it does to human life. Put yourself in the position of a cat that shows up at someone's door. You're cold, you're hungry. If you were that cat, would you want someone to take you in and look after you? Yes, you would. Now again, at that time I didn't know that particular cat was owned, but that's why I treat animals the way I do. I explain in my book that animals and children are closely related because they both share the innocence. Innocence being that state that souls are in before they develop an egoic identity. Before a certain age, children do not yet have the cognitive capacity to develop an egoic identity, a strong idea of themselves. Therefore, they are in a state of innocence. Animals are the same, except that unlike human children, they never develop that capacity to acquire an ego. Therefore, animals always retain that state of innocence. That's why I take animal welfare so seriously, and that's why Levi the Second and his unknown fate really haunts me. One, because I didn't know what was going on at the time. Two, I would have been powerless to stop it even if I did. And three, it's that uncertainty. I don't know what happened to the animal. So I wrote a poem, or I've started writing a poem that I could never sit here and read, because I wouldn't be able to. I would get upset doing so, basically. And I'm not one who likes to show emotion at all, as you all will know. I'm one who focuses on controlling emotion, so I'm not about to read this out at any time. But for me, it's really an exercise in catharsis. Because it's... And that's one thing I guess is good about writing poetry and writing any creative works, is that it can be a way to exorcise certain demons, I guess. But last week I talked about how... Well, I speculated about the relationship between poetry and music. And I said, as far as I can see, the only real difference between poetry and music is that music is accompanied by, music, is accompanied by instruments. And, I've looked more into the matter over the last week. I've looked more into the history of these things, and it turns out I'm completely right. Poetry is literally just lyrics without music. That's what it is. And that really helps, because I said last week, and there were several people that commented on that video to say that they agreed with me. I said last week that I didn't really get poetry that didn't rhyme. I didn't get it. When I'm reading it, like take a very famous poem, Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. I think it's the first 4 lines of that poem rhyme, but then suddenly he just stops rhyming. And I don't get that. So when I'm reading a poem like that, the lines that rhyme, they seem really good to me. But then he stops rhyming. And obviously Edgar Allan Poe, he did that on purpose. It's not like he couldn't think of a way to make these verses rhyme. He just didn't make them rhyme. But the comparison or the relationship between poems and songs, it helps me to understand what's going on there. Because what it essentially is that when one is devising a poem, they have in their heads a certain rhythm that the poem is going to. And so the one who reads poetry, their job essentially is to discover what that rhythm is by repeated readings of the poem. And that helps me to understand how poems that don't rhyme work. Because if a poem rhymes, the rhythm is evident, it speaks for itself. There's only one way that poem can naturally flow. But a poem that doesn't rhyme, the rhythm is more complicated, it's a more sophisticated composure, if you like. And so I get it now. I completely get it now. And so what I learned in the last week really, really helped me. And I'd certainly like to try some more sophisticated poems, because there is something very, I hate to say childlike, but it is kind of childlike. There is something kind of childlike about a poem that rhymes in the simple way that the poem I read earlier does rhyme. And so, yeah, I'd like to try more sophisticated things. And obviously, I will start employing metaphor and allegory and things like that, none of which was in that poem about the cat's teeth. That poem about the cat's teeth is very on the surface, very on the nose. It's just matter-of-factly telling you about the subject at hand. So, yeah, I'm working on lots of different poetry at the moment, and I'm really enjoying it. Each of these poems is, as I said, is written for a different purpose. The poem about the cat's teeth was to inform. The poem about Levi II is an exorcism for me of sorts. The poem about enduring is to help others. It's really great, and it's the best I can do. And don't get me wrong, I have no delusions of grandeur at all. I'm just a guy with a very, very tiny YouTube channel, nearly no Twitter followers, so I have no illusions that I'm going to change the world with any of this. It's about what we as individuals can do with whatever influence we have, and that's what I'm focusing on. So, as ever, I'm going to talk about the next David Bowie album in its catalogue. This one, we talked about David Bowie's Diamond Dogs from 1974 last week. Now we're moving on to 1975's Young Americans. David, in case you're not familiar with David Bowie, he released a hell of a lot of albums, almost one a year, right up until like 2002. So this is 1975's Young Americans, and I've got to say, from the perspective of most fans. In fact, before I get onto that, I'll look at the comments. Okay, Leo says, in Irish, Kate is pronounced the same as cat in English. I am not familiar with the word seath, but I think it would be pronounced set. That's possible. It is very possible. Okay, Leo says he looked it up and he's wrong. So what is the pronunciation then? Tate says, hello David, haven't died of COVID. Here to watch your little vid and welcome souls in the chat. And he says, catharsis. And Where's the Hidden Hand says, I still think about my dog Digby. That reminds me of a line from Peep Show at Comedy. You want me to buy her a dog the size of Digby, the biggest dog in the world? He says, I still think about my dog Digby I had as a kid. I loved that dog. Yeah, I've loved all my pets. And honestly, yeah. So, young Americans, from the perspective of most fans, Young Americans is still part of David Bowie's golden era. And most, not only fans, but most people would say that Bowie's worst period was during his 80s period when he was very, very commercial. Now that may be true, but personally, I'm not a huge fan of this Young Americans album. I like everything, well, almost everything that David Bowie did, except for Tin Machine. But this Young Americans album, it's okay, but it's not standout to me. It's not amazing. It's not Diamond Dogs, you know. It's not Black Star. So even though I would usually choose 2 songs from a David Bowie album, honestly, there are no songs that stand out enough on this album for me to choose 2. So I just chose one, the titular track, Young Americans, which is a great song, but that's the only track on the album that I think is really great. And when I choose songs as I go through David Bowie's catalogue, I'm choosing really standout songs that I regard as truly great and really worth listening to. I'm not just picking anything. So only one track this week, Young Americans, and it's linked in the description box below. So I mentioned last week that I was really eager to see Rocky vs. Drago, which is a director's cut of Rocky IV that Sylvester Stallone finally released. I got to see it this week, and I'm going to tell you straight up that I was very, very disappointed. Now I realise a lot of people watching may have no interest in this, but, well, it is kind of interesting, even if you're not interested in Rocky or Rocky IV specifically. For me, this is a case just like the comparison between the Alien 3 theatrical cut and the assembly cut of Alien 3. Now, an assembly cut is where they assemble together footage, but that footage is not necessarily finished. It hasn't had any, some of that footage may not have had any post-production work done to it, so it might be quite raw footage. That's what an assembly cut is. And this new version of Rocky IV, even though it's not referred to as an assembly cut, in many ways to me it strikes me as an assembly cut. It's not that good. And for me it's a situation just like with Alien 3 and the Alien 3 assembly cut, where what I'd really like is an ultimate version that combines different elements of the two. So first thing I want to talk about is, it's like Rocky says to Tommy Gunn in Rocky V, you've got a deception going here. Because one major feature that was touted of this director's cut of Rocky IV was that there was 40 minutes of new footage. So that's misleading in the extreme, because what you think when you hear that is, oh wow, the original Rocky IV was an hour and a half long. If there's 40 minutes of new footage, that takes it up to 2 hours and 10 minutes, which is right in line with at least the first 2 Rocky films that were about that length. That's completely misleading. Actually, the director's cut, the 40 minutes of new footage in the director's cut is primarily alternate takes of the exact same scenes we already have. So I don't know how much new footage there actually is, like new scenes there actually is in this director's cut, but it's a whole hell of a lot less than 40 minutes. I'd say it's less than 10 minutes. Now the problem with using alternate takes just so you can say, hey, we've got 40 minutes of new footage, is that they chose the best takes for the theatrical cut. So whenever they shoot a film, if they're doing a scene, there are going to be alternate takes of that scene. And when you're editing the film, you obviously want to choose the best takes. That's what they did in 1986 when Rocky IV was first released. So when Sylvester Stallone goes back and he wants to be able to say, hey, we've got 40 minutes of new footage in this film, and in order to justify that, he just uses as many alternate takes as possible. Because they already used the best takes, the result is that you've got a film that has mostly the same scenes, but inferior takes of those same scenes. So there's some shots in this director's cut, and you're looking at it and you're like, okay, why would you show this camera angle for this scene? This would be much better with a close-up. And the simple answer is because they already used the best take, they already used the best shot in the theatrical release, and Sylvester Stallone wants to use alternative footage as much as possible. So every single scene in this new director's cut that is also in the theatrical cut is an inferior version of the scene that we saw in the theatrical cut. It simply is. There's a lot of great new scenes in there that weren't in theatrical cut, like at Apollo Creed's funeral. His trainer Duke gives a great speech. Rocky gives an alternate speech in this director's cut, which is much better than the theatrical version. There are some scenes in this director's cut that definitely should have been in the theatrical version, but that's as good as it gets. Every scene that they share was better in the theatrical version. And there's some really senseless changes as well. Like, famously, in the fight, just before the fight between Ivan Drago and Apollo Creed, Apollo says to Drago, what's your matter? Get your hands up. You need an interpreter, time to go to school. And then Apollo Creed hits Ivan Drago's hands, which were held up like this, and Ivan Drago doesn't budge. And it's a really intimidating thing. How strong is this guy? Someone just tried to hit his hands and he didn't budge at all. And then he says and Ivan Drago says to Apollo Creed, "You will lose." It's a great moment. For some reason, probably because Sylvester Stallone again just wants to use alternate takes where possible. For some reason, they have it that Drago instead hits Apollo Creed's gloves, just like he hits Rocky's gloves before their fight. But the worst thing about this director's cut, and it's something that I find incredibly petty, you can only understand if you know something of the backstory of what went on during Rocky IV. So, in Rocky IV, Bridget Nielsen plays Ivan Drago's wife. She's in the film. Now, Sylvester Stallone and Bridget Nielsen, they got together during the making of Rocky IV. They got engaged, they got married, and they were together for, I think it was a year and a half before they divorced. And there was something of a love triangle going on between Sylvester Stallone, Bridget Nielsen, and Arnold Schwarzenegger, because a year before Rocky IV, Bridget Nielsen had worked with Arnold Schwarzenegger on Red Sonja. And so this created a rivalry between Sylvester Stallone and Arnold Schwarzenegger that lasted for many decades. And Sylvester Stallone still has very clearly a great sense of resentment against his ex-wife. So what he did in this director's cut is that he basically cut her from the film entirely. Anywhere that he could cut his ex-wife from, he did. She is almost completely excised from the film entirely. The only exceptions are those scenes where he couldn't possibly remove her from the film because it would destroy the narrative. If Sylvester Stallone could have completely cut her from the film, so it's like she was never even in it, he would have done that. He just couldn't do that. So that results in all these great moments that involve Bridget Nielsen just being completely cut. And that's completely ironic, because one of the justifications that Sylvester Stallone gave for making this film is that he wanted the film to better tie in to the later film Creed II, that features Adonis Creed going up against Ivan Drago's son. But if you cut Bridget Nielsen from your director's cut of Rocky IV, Bridget Nielsen, who is in Creed II, it makes even less sense, and it makes it connect even less well to Creed II. So, in all kinds of ways, this director's cut of Rocky IV was a big, big disappointment, and it really didn't have to be. There are so many other things as well. Like, one thing that's famous about Rocky IV is its montages. Rocky IV, because MTV was really, really popular at the time Rocky IV was released, Sylvester Stallone wanted that kind of style to it, very fast-paced, lots of montages, and that's why a lot of people love Rocky IV. But even the montages have been tainted in this one. So, like in the training montages, for example, you'll see Rocky and Ivan Drago doing their training, lifting weights or whatever. But for some mad reason, Sylvester Stallone decided to add these like stock sound effects over the top. So when Ivan Drago is like lifting his weights, you hear this clanking of the weights, and it kind of undermines the whole point of the training montages, because in the training montages, the music is supposed to be prominent, whether it's Vince DiCola's training montage or whether it's hearts on fire. That's what's supposed to be prominent. If you add all these stock sound effects over the top, it really undermines that. And a lot of the editing is just straight up sloppy, which is no surprise to me because Sylvester Stallone released videos showing him going through the process of re-editing this film. And if that is representative of how the film was actually re-edited, it's not surprising that the editing is so sloppy, because if you watch these videos, you've got this editor sitting there editing the film, and Sylvester Stallone is just there giving him vague instructions like, yeah, cut this bit, yeah, cut that bit, cut a few seconds of this. The basic problem is that the editing is not precise, as it wouldn't be in those circumstances. So you've got these really bizarre things, like in the theatrical cut of Rocky IV, when Apollo is fighting Ivan Drago, there's a point, and the point of this moment is to demonstrate that Apollo Creed has been out of the ring for 5 years and he's just not in a good shape to fight anyone, never mind Ivan Drago, the super soldier from Russia. So at a point in the beginning of the match, before a single punch has been thrown, Apollo Creed slips on the mat. He slips, and the commentator says, "There's a slip by Creed." In this new version, they cut that bit out. They cut the bit where Apollo Creed slips out, but what they don't cut out is the commentator saying that he slipped. So you hear the commentator saying that Apollo Creed slipped, but you don't actually see him slip. It's the most bizarre thing ever. And here's this. I'm going to say one more thing about it, because, okay, in fairness, you have to be eagle-eyed to catch this, right? But when you do catch it, you will fully understand what a sloppy effort this director's cut was. Now, usually I will happily say, look, these things are subjective. You might enjoy the director's cut more than the theatrical cut. You know, it's completely subjective. But to tell you the truth, I think there's a lot of cope going on right now among Rocky IV fans. I think there's a lot of people trying to convince themselves that they enjoyed this recut a lot more than they did. And here's a perfect example of how sloppy it is. So, Sylvester Stallone completely recut, did a different edit of the final fight between Rocky Balboa and Ivan Drago. He reordered a lot of the scenes, and he was trying to make it more realistic, because in the original Rocky IV, it's very bombastic. But that's one of its virtues as far as I'm concerned. It's very 80s. But in I think it's round 8 of this recut version, and by the way, in case you haven't seen Rocky IV, the whole end fight is a montage basically after the second round. I think it's in round 8 in this recut version, you see a shot, and the problem for Sylvester Stallone, and what he didn't notice, is that in the background of the stadium where Rocky and Drago are fighting, there's actually a big bright board showing what round it is, and in round 8 in this director's cut version, this big bright board very clearly displays that it's actually round 12. See, what Sylvester Stallone did was he took that moment from what was round 12, and he put it in what is meant to be round 8, but he failed to notice this big board in the background displaying that it's round 12. And you know, when I didn't like the director's cut up until that point, because I noticed all these things I've just explained to you. But when I saw that, I thought, oh, that's it. You know, that's it. That sums up how sloppy this is. This is meant to be round 8, but the board in the background clearly shows it's round 12. Now, the piece of footage that I'm talking about is about 5 seconds long, but I noticed it because it's a big board in the background. How on earth, if you're Sylvester Stallone or this editor, how on earth do you not notice that when you're meticulously re-editing this film? How do you not notice, well, wait a minute, we're trying to convey that this is round 8 of the boxing match, but the display in the background actually says it's round 12. How do you fail to notice that? The answer is Sylvester Stallone is standing there throwing you vague instructions, and because he's Sylvester Stallone, you don't really want to question him. Like, if you're the editor and Sylvester Stallone is re-editing one of his best-known films, most loved films, and he gives you an instruction, you don't really want to pipe up and say, excuse me, Mr. Stallone, there's a big problem with this. You probably don't want to do that, because, you know, you don't want to upset Sylvester Stallone. So, Very disappointing overall. Very, very disappointing. So, another thing I want to talk about, as the description box says, and this is something. Look, usually I'll try and find some kind of logic, some kind of excuse to just to talk about the subjects that I'm talking about. Try and form some kind of coherent theme or narrative for each of these shows. I can't think of an excuse to talk about this. It's just something that's been on my mind a lot recently, and I want to get it off my chest. I'm a big fan of 90s episodic television. Television has changed a lot. TV shows have changed a lot. You can't even call them TV shows anymore because a lot of them are streamed online exclusively. So let's just call them shows. Shows have changed a lot. Because in the modern day, a show typically, all of its episodes will be dedicated to a single narrative. It's all about one story, and every episode is dedicated to exploring and expounding upon that story. It's a very long form kind of storytelling. And you can either like that or not, depends. But the point is that if, for example, you start watching Breaking Bad or you start watching Game of Thrones and you miss an episode or two, you're going to not understand certain things about the narrative because every episode is essential to understanding that narrative. So when I talk about the episodic television of the 90s, what I'm referring to is a different style of doing TV shows. A style wherein what you have is episodic television, which means that each episode of the show is its own standalone thing, essentially. So Highlander is a great example of this, a TV show from the 90s. In every episode of Highlander, Duncan MacLeod, well, in almost every episode, he would come up against yet another immortal that was seeking revenge on him for something he did like 100 or 200 years ago. That was the format of the show. And so you could miss like almost every episode of a series, and then you could catch an episode and you'd understand what was going on because it was a self-contained story. You didn't have to watch the episodes that came previously to understand what was going on. That doesn't mean there was never an overarching plot. There often was. What would typically happen is that you would have these standalone stories, and they constituted the majority of any given season of a show, but there would be what you might call these mythology episodes that did deal with the overarching plot, and they would usually be at the opening of a season, at the end of a season, and sometimes, spaced out in single episodes in between. Sometimes you would have stories that dealt with the overarching mythology stretched out over 2 or 3 episodes during a season, things like that. But for the most part, this was episodic television where most of the episodes stood alone. I really like that for the same reason that I really like the Pulp Fiction that I talked about last week, the Pulp Fiction of the 30s, Robert E. Howard, Lovecraft, and so forth. Because they are episodic too. You don't have to read all of the Conan stories to understand any one of them. You can pick up any of Robert E. Howard's Conan stories, and what you're reading is a self-contained adventure. Now, if you have read all of the other Conan stories, then you have a greater insight on the character, you have a greater insight on his past and his future, and that's great, but the stories are self-contained, and I like that. And that's what I liked about 90s episodic television. So, I say all that to get onto the main point here, which is that one of the best examples, certainly the most famous examples because it created a pop culture phenomenon, one of the best examples of 90s episodic television was The X-Files. I loved that show as a kid, even though it freaked me out as a kid. There were certain episodes that freaked me out, especially the season 2 episode, The Host, which featured the Fluke Man, these creatures that swam about in the sewers. If you've ever seen The X-Files, it's one of those episodes you'll remember. Of course, one of the most famous monsters from one of the standalone X-Files episodes was Eugene Victor Toombs. He was featured in 2 episodes. But The X-Files was centered around conspiracy. And this is something this is what I've been thinking about recently. It's something I've wanted to comment on a lot because I've never seen anyone else talk about it. How 9/11 killed the X-Files. You see, the X-Files was centered around conspiracy. There's going to be major spoilers for the X-Files here, just in case any of you are planning to watch it 30 years after the fact. But essentially, you've got two characters in the X-Files, Fox Mulder and Dana Scully. Now, Fox Mulder is convinced that the government is hiding the truth about extraterrestrials. And so, Fox Mulder is someone who he's not stupid, but he's very open-minded to all these conspiracy theories. He's very open-minded to mythology and things like that. And then you've got his partner, Dana Scully, who's very skeptical about these things and is always looking for the most rational scientific approach. And that's what makes them work so well together. And it's what makes their on-screen relationship so enduring. It's just one of those great TV relationships. So the X-Files is about, and what motivates Fox Mulder is the fact that when he was a kid, as far as he remembers, his sister was abducted by aliens. And so the TV show is about him trying to expose what the government is hiding about extraterrestrial life and the history of extraterrestrial involvement and the ongoing conspiracy to silence that truth, essentially, and also find out what happened to his sister. So that's what the X-Files is about. It's about a mistrust of government. It's about what are they hiding from us? What are they keeping secret from us? And because the X-Files was one of these episodic TV series, it wasn't just about aliens. It dealt with all kinds of subject matter. But in almost every case, it wasn't just about the monster of the week or the conspiracy of the week. It was about the fact that the powers that be, the man, in line with 90s culture, the man was keeping the truth from us and they couldn't be trusted. That's what the X-Files was about. The first 9 seasons of the X-Files from 1994 right up until 2002. That's what the X-Files was. And here's how 9/11 killed the X-Files. It's because, as I said, throughout the 90s there was this mistrust of authority. There was this mistrust of government. That was very much the zeitgeist. And that's why, as far as I'm concerned, the X-Files was as popular as it was, because people already had this innate suspicion of the government and they were asking questions, what's this about? And here's this show that centers around that very, very question. The X-Files not only fit into that zeitgeist, it kind of propelled it even further. Here's how 9/11 killed that. It's because after 9/11, conspiracy theories became unpopular. They didn't want people questioning the narrative surrounding 9/11. And yes, Tate, I was going to say that. Tate mentions the X-Files spin-off, The Lone Gunman pilot. The US government conspires to hijack a plane and hit the World Trade Center to blame the act on terrorists and gain support for a profit-making war. Yes, for anyone who doesn't know, in the X-Files there were these 3 characters called the Lone Gunman. Great characters. They got a spin-off TV show that lasted only 1 season, and the pilot of that TV show, well, what Tate just said happened. The US government conspires to hijack a plane and hit the World Trade Center to blame the act on terrorists and to gain support for a profit-making war. But when that did happen in real life on 9/11, the powers that be, the government, they no longer treated conspiracy theories as something that could be ignored, as something that could be endured at all, because now people were questioning the narrative of 9/11. Now they were saying, okay, how did these planes cause these buildings to collapse in the way that they did? They collapsed in a way that makes it look like a controlled demolition, and how on earth did 2 airplanes hitting 2 buildings cause 3 buildings, namely the 3rd building being Building 7, to also fall down? All kinds of questions around 9/11 that the government and the powers that be didn't want to be asked. And so, whereas previously, and so because the government pushed this narrative and the media began pushing this anti-conspiracy theory narrative, the NPCs went into action and just repeated that propaganda, repeated those party lines, as it were, and suddenly it became deeply uncool to talk about conspiracy theories. Unlike in the 90s where it was vogue, and that's why a show like The X-Files became so popular. So that's how 9/11 killed the X-Files. It's because after 9/11, the powers that be, they couldn't tolerate these kind of conspiracy theories anymore because they were asking very uncomfortable questions that were not answered by, for example, the 9/11 Commission report, which, if I recall correctly, I don't think that even mentioned Building 7, which, this is YouTube, I can't say too much. But that's how 9/11 killed the X-Files. Now, you had that original run of the X-Files from 1994 to 2002, seasons 1 to 9. Chris Carter brought the X-Files back during President Trump's presidency. Here's the problem. Chris Carter was one of those individuals that were suffering from what you would call Trump derangement syndrome. We didn't like Trump at all. And so when Fox Mulder and Dana Scully return in season 10 of the X-Files during Trump's presidency, there was season 10 and season 11, absolutely awful seasons. Fox Mulder, given this new cultural climate, he's the exact opposite of the character that he was during the 90s. For two reasons. Again, one, the cultural climate had changed, and Chris Carter was essentially a different person, and he was suffering from, again, Trump derangement syndrome. So here's the moment that summed it up, and this happens within the first 5 minutes of the first episode of season 10. Because Chris Carter felt the way he did about President Trump, and this is all occurring during Trump's presidency, and specifically at the time where he's having these quarrels with the FBI, here's what he has Fox Mulder say. Fox Mulder, in the first episode, at the opening of season 10 of the X-Files, says this. He says something along the lines of, we live in a time where, the president is calling into question even the FBI now. Wait, yeah, if you're familiar with the X-Files at all, you'll know how mind-blowing that is. Chris Carter makes Fox Mulder say, we live in a time now where, the president is even questioning the integrity of the FBI. To understand what a violation of the character that is, to understand what an abomination that line of dialogue is, you have to really know the X-Files, the original 9 seasons. The FBI were at the core of the conspiracy that Fox Mulder was fighting against. The conspiracy that Fox Mulder was dealing with, the conspiracy which was, by the way, to conceal the truth about aliens from the American people, and also to, this is where we're getting on very dodgy ground, to create alien-human hybrids via vaccinations and things like that. So basically what happened, the basic story of the X-Files, what is revealed is that aliens are planning to colonize the Earth in 2012. That's what the government are keeping secret. And there's this faction within the government called the Syndicate that have been trying to make deals with the aliens. They've basically been selling the human race out to the aliens in order to save themselves from the aliens. One thing they've been trying to do is create a vaccine from the alien virus. And they figure that in order to try and survive the apocalypse in 2012 when the aliens invade, what they'll do is they'll start creating human-alien hybrids that can hopefully survive that particular Holocaust. So that's what the TV show, that's what Fox Mulder and Dana Scully eventually uncover throughout the X-Files. And they expose that conspiracy, and in the end, the Syndicate, the conspirators, they are killed, but then the conspiracy continues under new hands. It's a very complicated storyline, but essentially, aliens are gradually taking over the Earth, and they're being helped by the government in order so that the government figures can save themselves. That's what's going on throughout the X-Files. And the thing is, the FBI is at the heart of this, because Fox Mulder and Dana Scully, they are FBI agents, and most of the problems they face come internally because they're having to struggle against the FBI's own corruption, the fact that the FBI is infiltrated. There's a particular character in the original run of the X-Files called Alex Krycek, and he dies in the last episode of season 8. And one of the last things he says to Fox Mulder before he tries to kill him, he's pointing a gun at Fox Mulder, and he says to Fox Mulder, "That's why I have to do this, because you know how deep it goes, right into the heart of the FBI." So the point is, that the FBI was the bad guy in the original run of the show. They were one of the main bad guys because they were portrayed as an institution that had good people in it, like Walter Skinner and of course Fox Mulder and Dana Scully themselves, but that had been infiltrated not just by these government conspirators, but by these alien human hybrids that were replacements for the actual human beings who are now dead. So that's what the X-Files was about. So to give Fox Mulder the line, "We live in a time where the president even questions the integrity of the FBI," it's the most absurd thing you can possibly imagine. So if you watch seasons 10 and 11 of the X-Files, what you'll see, aside from some really bad storylines and it's not interesting at all, a complete violation of the mythology, what you'll see is a Fox Mulder that is the exact opposite character to who he was in the original 9 seasons. That's why I did not like the season 10 and 11, because it was an absolute betrayal of everything that came before. Again, one, because the cultural zeitgeist had changed. It was no longer fashionable to question the government, especially after 9/11. It was no longer fashionable to question the government and to question institutions like the FBI. Only right-wing extremists did that. Therefore, this new X-Files, it couldn't do what it did in the 90s because that wouldn't play well anymore. And secondly, because the writer of the show, the creator of the show, Chris Carter, he's a different man than he was in the 90s. And whereas in the 90s he fully appreciated the sentiment of not trusting government. He fully appreciated the fact that sometimes the government and powerful institutions hide things from people. He's now essentially a company man, and he's parroting the government line, he's parroting the media line, and so when he writes season 10 of the X-Files, he's putting those new ideas into the mouth of Fox Mulder where they obviously don't belong. And I just find it's a very interesting thing, because as much as we're talking about pop culture here and something that is ostensibly not a serious thing, it's just a TV show, what it's a great illustration of is how things can change. It's a great illustration of how when the government and the media put a particular narrative or a particular notion into motion, people can just fall in line with it. And it radically changes the culture, and it radically changes artistic creations that are produced within that culture, to the point where you can have a character like Fox Mulder being the exact opposite of who he once was, because it's no longer acceptable to question the government and to question institutions like the FBI. So again, as much as we're talking about TV shows and it may not seem to be that serious, it offers us a great insight on the power of culture, and it demonstrates the reality that is so often stated, which is that politics is downstream from culture. It simply is, and it's a great demonstration of that. Now, Liam says, also the spin-off Millennium with the government conspiring to release a plague on the populace. I love Millennium. I love it, love it, love it. Millennium, for those of you who don't know, is it's not a spin-off from the X-Files in the same way that the Lone Gunman was, but it's created by Chris Carter as well, and it's set in the same universe as the X-Files. And in season 7 of the X-Files, the show Millennium lasted only 3 seasons, and they didn't really give the character of Frank Black, the star of Millennium, a good send-off. So in season 7 of the X-Files, there's an episode called Millennium. And Frank Black features in that. It was a way to give him a proper farewell, essentially. But Millennium was a great TV show. The problem with that TV show is that it didn't have a focus. So Millennium is about Frank Black. He's a criminal profiler, and he has what is essentially a psychic power. He is able to see through the eyes. Well, I don't know if it's really a psychic power or if it's just the way it's portrayed on screen, but essentially he sees whatever the killer in any given episode sees. And so the first season of Millennium is essentially each episode is essentially about a murderer, and Frank Black is working with this consultancy group called the Millennium Group to help uncover these murders using his special ability to see through the eyes of the killer. That's what the first season is primarily about. But then in season 2, the show got different writers and it became like another version of the X-Files. And that's where you have the element that Liam mentioned being introduced. This plague, it was the Nuremberg virus, was it, I think? It was something like that. Some kind of virus. In the end, basically, the Millennium Group was working with certain government elements to unleash a plague upon the population, essentially, which is what they did. And Frank Black's own wife dies at the end of season 2 because of this. Yeah, it was the Marienburg virus that they release on the population. And so season 3, whereas in season 1 and season 2, Frank Black had been working with this Millennium Group, in season 3, this Millennium Group has been revealed as an evil cult, essentially, and they really are a cult, complete with religious elements and everything. And it's about Frank Black just trying in vain to work against the Millennium Group and all the power that they have. And that's what I really enjoy about that show, is that Frank Black never has kind of like Mulder and Scully, Frank Black, he never has a chance up against the Millennium Group. They have too much power, there's too much there's too much force arrayed against them, essentially. And so what happens in the end of season 3 of Millennium is that Frank has to take his daughter and run away because they can't win against the Millennium Group. And one of the what's at the heart of Millennium, for me at least, is that Frank Black has a friendship with a guy called Peter Watts. And Peter Watts is actually a member of the Millennium Group. But Peter Watts is under the impression that the Millennium Group are the good guys. He doesn't see the things that Frank sees. But over time, because they have this strong friendship, Peter respects Frank. And so even though he believes the Millennium Group that he works for is trying to do good for humanity, when Frank consistently points out, hey, look what they're responsible for here, how can you justify their action here? Eventually, Peter Watts turns against the Millennium Group too, and in the final episode, he gets shot in the head. And he basically gave his life to save Frank Black and his daughter. That's what happens, and so that friendship is really at the core of Millennium for me. But yeah, Millennium is a fantastic TV show, really, really is. When it comes to like the Lone Gunman spin-off, I'm not one who would recommend that because it was a light-hearted comedy kind of show. I'm not really into that. But the Millennium is a really great show in and of itself. It was a really powerful show, and I just wish that 1, they had more of a focus for it, and 2, it hadn't been cancelled so quickly, because that show could have really gone to some interesting places. Because it's not just about conspiracies in the same way that the X-Files was. Yes, you had the malevolent Millennium Group, but there was also a demonic influence. There were demons wandering around, and Frank Black was one of the few individuals that could kind of see them. And of course, these demons were infiltrating the government and the Millennium Group and so forth. Very similar to how the aliens did in the X-Files. So yeah, very interesting. You know what it's like? It's like an alternate, more hellish version of the X-Files, because one of the inspirations for Millennium was the film Seven, with Brad Pitt and Morgan Freeman. And you can tell that from the very first episode because it's very bleak. The colours are kind of washed out. It's a very, very depressing. In fact, I remember seeing a kind of making of documentary about Millennium, and they had major problems with depression when they were making Millennium, because week after week, the cast and the crew, they're telling these stories and portraying these stories about really, really horrific killers doing really, really horrific things. And whereas in the X-Files, you could be kind of detached from that because a lot of it involves ghosts and all kinds of supernatural elements. With Millennium, a lot of the time you're just dealing with straight up human killers, so it's more affecting because it's more realistic. So there was a great problem with depression during the filming of that show. But yeah, it is a really great show that is very much worth watching. Tate says, I want to believe. I want to believe. Where's the head and hand? The Smoking Man. Oh yeah, there's another example of absurdity. In the final episode of the original run of The X-Files, the Season 9 episode The Truth, the Smoking Man, aka Cancer Man, he finally gets killed, and there's no doubt that he's dead. He literally gets hit point blank with a missile, and you literally see the flesh peel off him until you see his skull. That's how dead the Smoking Man was at the end of the original run of The X-Files. But because he's the Smoking Man, and he's inextricably linked with The X-Files, when Chris Carter resurrected the show during Trump's presidency for season 10 and 11, guess what he did? He brought the Smoking Man back and just pretended, he survived that direct missile. You think I'm engaging in hyperbole here? No, there's no hyperbole in what I'm saying. It was a hellfire missile to the face. It was literally a hellfire missile to the face that we saw in graphic detail. There is no way the Smoking Man survived that. So, another example of absurdity, when the Smoking Man comes back in season 10 and 11, even though he got hit by a hellfire missile and we literally saw his flesh just disintegrate until he was nothing but a skeleton, we actually saw that on the screen. In season 10 and 11, they must have been joking. In season 10 and 11, he literally has the facial. If you've seen a burn victim, someone who was caught up in a house fire, for example, they have false parts of their face. That's what the Smoking Man has, but it's not even that severe. It's just a patch here and there, and he's perfectly fine. He took a hellfire missile to the face, and he was, burned down to a skeleton like he'd got into a fight with Sonya Blade. But yeah, he's fine now because we want to bring this character back. Tate says the anime Vexil 2077 from 2007 is another interesting example of art imitating life. Whereas the Hidden Hand says burnt to a crisp. He really was burnt to a crisp. Tate says merely a flesh wound. The other insult, I don't want to go on about this for too long, but another insulting thing about season 10 and 11 of The X-Files is that they do away with the alien conspiracy. So remember, the original run of The X-Files was about this alien conspiracy and how the aliens were plotting to take over Earth in collaboration with certain government elements, including the FBI, and they'd set their date of colonization to 2012. So when The X-Files is brought back after 2012 with season 10 and 11, just as another example of how misguided the writer is, and as another insight into his political views, how they explain away the lack of alien colonization in 2012? The Smoking Man explains... Prepare to cringe, by the way. Prepare to cringe. If this isn't some of the most crass... If this isn't an example of some of the most crude injection of someone's political perspective into a character ever, then I don't know what is. The Smoking Man explains to Mulder that the reason that he doesn't have to worry about aliens anymore, and the reason that they didn't colonize the world in 2020, was because of climate change. Was because the aliens were no longer interested in a planet that's dying due to overheating. So, whereas the original run of the X-Files centered around this conspiracy where aliens were going to take over Earth, and it's a conspiracy that's been going on for decades, ever since the alien landing at Roswell, suddenly the aliens decide, this planet is suffering from climate change. We don't have much use for it then. So, after decades of trying to infiltrate the human population and corrupting their government officials, we're just going to give up on this planet because it's gonna be burned up soon. So Chris Carter achieved two things. Well, from his perspective, he achieved two things in giving the Smoking Man that line. He managed to explain away why he can't be bothered dealing with the alien conspiracy anymore, and two, he managed to inject his own views on climate change in it as well. But it's the most crude piece of writing, and the most such a crude example of a writer injecting their own political views into a show that I think I've ever seen. And good writers don't do that, and unfortunately it's become unfashionable now. You see, if you were Chris Carter and you were a good writer, and you were resurrecting the X-Files, and you were making season 10 and 11, you wouldn't inject your own political views into the mouth of Fox Mulder where it very clearly didn't belong anymore. Where if you give Fox Mulder your perspective, then you're violating the character. If you were a good writer, you wouldn't do that, because a good writer knows that they are not meant to give the characters they write their own perspective unless that character actually does share their perspective. Fox Mulder is anti-establishment through and through. He does not like the FBI because the FBI have been instrumental in working against him for his whole life. They have been instrumental in an alien conspiracy, and they have tried to kill him and his partner umpteen times. They killed his father, all kinds of things. That's not who Fox Mulder is. A good writer would never have done that. A bad writer would do that, though. Neurocraft quotes the smoking man. I spent the last few years building up an immunity to Hellfire missiles. You know, I'm tempted just to look that moment up on YouTube just so you can see how absurd it is. Where's the Hidden Hand says, the aliens, they got their maths wrong. Well, apparently so, and they just decided, no, we're not going to do this anymore despite our great plans. And you know what the worst thing is about season 10 and 11 of the X-Files? Is that because it did parrot the party line, because it did go along with the media narrative and things like that, it got glowing reviews. You know, it was one of those situations where there's a disparity between the critical reviews and the user reviews, because any fan of the X-Files who watched this knew they were watching a catastrophe. They knew that this was a betrayal of the character of Fox Mulder and a betrayal of everything that the X-Files was about. But of course, the critics, you know, the professionals, the experts, they loved it. You know, here's Fox Mulder basically repeating their own opinions, so they loved every minute of it. If you look up season 10 and 11 of the X-Files, it's got glowing reviews from all of these critics, and it was just horrible. That's all I can really say about that. So, I was thinking this week about something spiritually. I was thinking about the fact that one thing that is emphasized, particularly in the Dharmic traditions, and especially Buddhism, is the necessity and the desire to escape from this material realm. Now, it makes sense that this would be emphasized in the Dharmic traditions, and especially in Buddhism, because, of course, Buddha's original dilemma revolved around suffering. And I've related the story before, but you can never tell the story of Buddha too many times. So, Buddha grew up in a wealthy home, and his parents were very determined that he should be sheltered from the harsh realities of life, which meant Buddha grew up very ignorant of the realities of life, until one day when his attendant took him out to walk around the streets, essentially. And the attendant took him to walk around the streets 3 separate times, and each time he saw something that disturbed him, something that he wasn't familiar with because he'd been so sheltered within the palace. I can't remember the exact order, but I believe the first time he sees an old person, so he in fact, I do know the order. First time he sees an old person, and so he becomes aware of mortality, the fact that all of us age and will eventually die, which he wasn't aware of before. The second time he goes out, he sees a sick person, so he becomes aware of our fragility as human beings. He becomes aware of sickness and illness and suffering. And the third time, he sees a corpse being pulled along on a corpse cart, and so he becomes aware of death. And these things greatly disturb Buddha. And even though at a point he is married and has a child, these questions are haunting him. You know, what's it all about? Why are we here suffering like this in the world? And so what he does is he abandons his wife and child, and much like Yeshua, he goes off into the wilderness. And I've talked before about the amazing similarities between the story of Buddha and the story of Yeshua. But like Yeshua, Buddha goes off into the wilderness to seek enlightenment. And like Yeshua, Buddha is tempted, essentially, and tested by what the Buddhist tradition calls Mara, which is essentially their version of Satan, this evil entity that is putting Buddha to the test in the same way that Satan put Yeshua to the test by tempting him in the wilderness. But before he gets to that point, Buddha is trying to figure out the way to enlightenment. And Buddha, of course, was a Hindu. Just one of the many similarities between Buddhism and Christianity and Buddha and Christ. Christ, of course, was a Jew fundamentally, and from him a new religion sprang. In the same way, Buddha was a Hindu, and from him a new religion would eventually spring. But Buddha was a Hindu, and so when he went out into the wilderness, he went to join all these Hindu gurus that were out there, bearing in mind that Hinduism is an ancient religion, and it existed for 2,500 years before Buddha was born. So Buddha goes out into the wilderness and he meets all these Hindu gurus, and they are also seeking enlightenment, but they're all trying different things. They're doing the same things that Hindu gurus even now can be found doing in India. So a lot of them are mortifying their flesh. They're putting pins through their flesh. They're hanging themselves up from hooks, thinking that pain is a way to somehow purify themselves and a way to reach enlightenment. Other gurus are going in the exact opposite direction. They're not starving themselves. They're not inflicting pain upon themselves. They're actually overindulging themselves, and like a twisted version of Epicureanism. But they're really overindulging themselves, and so Buddha tries following all these different gurus, and he falls in with this particular group that believes in really making the flesh suffer. So Buddha essentially starts starving himself, and as I've pointed out before, while the classical depiction of Buddha presents him as a big fat guy laughing very happy, that's actually not Buddha. That's a portrayal of a Chinese monk that lived just in the last few centuries. A Buddhist Chinese monk that lived in the last few centuries. I can't remember his name. But Buddha himself was actually really thin, precisely because he fell in with this group that, amongst other things, believed in starving themselves to purify the flesh and to somehow reach enlightenment through doing that. And so Buddha was down to eating like 3 grains of rice a day. And at a certain point, he was sitting under the famous Bodhi tree, which is a kind of tree. And yeah, he attains, after enduring temptations from Mara in the same way that Yeshua endured temptations from Satan, he reaches enlightenment. And what he comes to see is that all of these Hindu gurus out in the wilderness going to all these extremes, they're all wrong. And this is where the famous middle way comes from in Buddhism. This understanding of Buddha that you shouldn't go to any extreme. You shouldn't be a glutton, but you shouldn't starve yourself either. And that's how the famous Buddhist middle way was formed. It came from this realization of Buddha. And so Buddha became enlightened. His former fellows found him eating more than 3 grains of rice, and they said, "You're a failure, you become a glutton now that you're eating a whole bowl of rice." And he explained to them, "No, I've just realized that you were completely wrong in your approach, and so are these other gurus. I've learned that everything in life, there must be a balance to the way that we approach everything in life." And Buddha would eventually lay out the Eightfold Path and so forth. The point is that because that's what Buddha's story is, suffering is in a way central to Buddhism itself. And so it makes sense that Dharmic traditions like Buddhism would emphasize not just the necessity of, but also the obvious desire to escape from material reality. Because as Buddhists will often flat out say, life is suffering. It's the very dilemma that Buddha himself was trying to wrestle with. And I feel the same way myself. I think you have to be very careful about how you articulate this, because you could give individuals the wrong idea. I enjoy life in the sense that I enjoy the things I'm able to do in life. I don't hate life. I'm obviously not depressed or anything like that. I enjoy what I'm able to do, like talking about poetry earlier. I enjoy trying to write poetry. I enjoy writing things. There's all kinds of things I enjoy doing here in the material realm. And I also recognize that the material realm is the only place I will have the opportunity to do such things. And that's why I value the time that I have. I value the moments that I have in order to do those things. And it's why I don't waste any time. It's why I'm able to get my book finished, my novellas finished, and my poems finished, because I value time, and I know that this is the only time I'll have to do those things. But that should not be confused with one thinking that the material realm is the best thing that there is, and it should certainly not be confused with anyone thinking that I would like to remain here for all eternity, because that's obviously far from the case. Obviously, anyone that recognizes a higher spiritual truth has to acknowledge that the realities that lie beyond the material realm, assuming we're not talking about a hellish realm, heaven, or whatever you'd like to call it, obviously it's going to be vastly superior to anything that can be found here in the world. And obviously Buddhism doesn't have the same conception of heaven in the way that the Abrahamic faiths do, but they still recognize that what they call nirvana, and whatever any given Buddhist might believe about the afterlife or may not believe about the afterlife, they recognize that these things are obviously superior to life here in the world, because suffering is inherent to life here in the world. So I think it's very necessary to draw a balance in the way that we express these things. Because if you just say, for example, life is suffering and we should be seeking to know God so that we can escape from the cycle of reincarnation and not have to come back here, that could very easily convey a message to the person you're speaking to that you don't enjoy life, you're a miserable person, and that's why you're focused on the spiritual. That's why I'm always very keen to emphasize that no, I'm a very happy individual. Anyone who knows me in real life, and I think I hope it comes across when I do these live streams as well, I'm a very content individual. And I enjoy the things that I do in life. I enjoy the things that we're able to do here in the world, but I still have my priorities straight. It's not that I want to know God and never return here because I hate life and I'm totally miserable. Just the opposite. It's that I was on the verge of a pithy saying there, along the lines of what Brutus said in William Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. When he tries to justify killing Caesar, he says, not that I loved Caesar less, but that I loved Rome more. Not that I love the material realm less, but that I love God more. It's not that I'm miserable here and I hate this world. It's that I recognize the same problems in this world that everyone before me has, every mystic before me has. I recognize, as the Buddha did, and as Buddhists generally do, that suffering is inherent to life, and that no matter how content I personally may be, no matter how happy I personally may be, and how thankful I may be going about my projects, I still recognize the true nature of the material realm, and it is a fallen nature, and it is a nature that inherently breeds suffering. Therefore, yes, I would very much like to escape from it and live in eternal bliss forever rather than be reborn here. Just me, but that's my take on it. I think it's very necessary. I was just thinking about this over the last week, that it's very necessary to emphasize that, because again, if you just say that suffering is inherent to life and I can't wait to escape from the cycle of reincarnation and never have to come back here, you're going to kind of play into the hands of those philosophical materialists who will argue things like, oh, the only reason people believe in God is as a coping mechanism. People only believe in God because they can't deal with reality and they want to believe in this fairy, this big man in the sky that will make things all right in the end. It's a really childish belief. That's what you give ammunition to if you're not careful in the way that you express things. If you put yourself across as a miserable person. And I've been speaking about Buddhism, but this is also true to Christianity as well. This is also true to what the New Testament says. And how often does the Apostle Paul, for example, mention the joy of the Spirit, the joy of the Holy Spirit? You're not meant to lead a miserable life. Being miserable does not make you somehow inherently more spiritual. In fact, I would say the exact opposite. If you're miserable, then your spirituality, whatever form it may take, is obviously not doing anything for you. It's supposed to do the opposite of that. That's why the Apostle Paul speaks about the joy of the Holy Spirit. It's why Yeshua talked about the joy of the Father. It's why Buddha talked about the bliss of enlightenment. You're not supposed to be miserable when you have a fulfilling spiritual life. It's the exact opposite. Tate says, do not love the world or anything in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in them. I was going to quote that very verse because the Apostle John there was right in saying that in the first epistle of John, as he did. Just look at those, you see, those who don't get what I'm saying, they've never had any experience of the spiritual, and so because of that, they can't conceive of anything higher than the best of what there is here in the world. And so if someone says that, even if they add a caveat by saying, I enjoy life, I live a very happy, content life, but I still don't want to come back here again and have to go through, what I did growing up, go through your first teenage romance, go through whatever suffering you went through in your past and things like that. I don't want to go through that again. So as much as I enjoy life here, I want to know God, and I want this life in this world to be my last. Those people won't understand that because as far as they're concerned, this world is all that there is. And on a similar note, someone made a post on a tweet this week, and they were trying to explain the reason why the Western world had become so susceptible to these authoritarian governments. He was giving reasons as to why so many people are gullible to the government line. And he listed a whole bunch of reasons, all of which had merit. He talked about people being less informed than they were previously, and a whole host of things. But he didn't mention the most important thing at all, because he's one of these guys who's kind of secular and doesn't want to mention God because that'll make him seem uncool among his peers. But yeah, the main reason that people in the West are so vulnerable to authoritarian governments, and the reason they're so seemingly gullible, is because of their rejection of God. Because if you reject God, then the state necessarily then becomes the ultimate authority. Necessarily, because there is nothing higher than the government once you've rejected God. And if the state becomes your highest authority, then it is the state that dictates what rights and freedoms you can and cannot have. So when you have, as you do in the Western world, primarily secular individuals who don't recognize any authority higher than the government, it makes complete sense to them and doesn't offend them at all when the government say, as the government in Austria has now, hey, in February of 2022, vaccinations will be mandatory. To these individuals, it makes complete sense because it's the government and there is no higher authority than that. Whereas, if you have a relationship, if you have a mere belief in God, that's good. Okay, that's a good thing. But even better if you have direct experience of God, aka a living relationship with God, because then you know that no, these governments are not our highest authority. If anything, as the Apostle Paul said, they have merely been granted temporary authority by God, and they better use it well and wisely and not send themselves to hell in the process. But no, these governments are not the final authority. I am free not because some government official or some government says I'm free. I'm free because God created me to be free, and God, through my conscience, urges me to be free. And it's God that grants me my rights and my freedoms. When you have that belief, then you see very clearly the crimes of these authoritarian governments. Then you see very clearly how power hungry and evil they are in trying to use this phony pandemic to steal everyone's civil rights. If you don't have that understanding of God, that acceptance of God, then all you're looking at is your master benevolently dishing out freedoms to you and regretfully restraining those freedoms from other individuals because it's necessary and for their health. So God and acceptance of God is so vital in maintaining one's sense of right and wrong, and a proper perspective on who exactly has authority over you and who grants you your rights and freedoms in the first place. This is why authoritarian governments always try and undermine the transcendent. Whatever form it takes, they always try to undermine it. It's why they will try to often either subvert religious institutions or misdirect the target of people's faith. So, for example, I'm sure you're all aware of examples here in the West where churches have been subverted, and these pastors and these priests and these ministers, they are just giving the party line, even though it's completely contrary to what their mission should be. Likewise, in places like North Korea, and even to an extent in China, you have these political figures being venerated as deities. Now, the reason that authoritarian regimes will subvert in that way and misdirect people's the object of people's faith, or the direction of people's faith, is because they've learned by now that human beings, souls in human form, as I would say it, they have an innate need, an innate desire to worship something higher than them. That's why authoritarian governments know that rather than trying to abolish religion or destroy religion, it's best to subvert them, or it's best to make sure that people place their faith in something else. Not destroy their faith, but place it in something else. And that's how you end up with these demigods in North Korea. The idea that the leader of North Korea is somehow divine, and that his family is divine and has always been divine. Whereas and again, you can see similar elements in ironically communist China. People will need to worship something, and as I say in my book, when people reject God, while philosophical materialists will often claim, I've rejected God, I'm free from the tyranny of religion. You just look at these people and you can see it's the exact opposite of the truth, because when you reject God, as I say in the book, you will find something else to venerate, you will find something else to worship, and more often than not, that new target of your worship, of your faith, will be state power. That is why we see what we see here in the Western world. And I will say again, as I have before, that this undermining of religious institutions, it has been done intentionally. It's been done deliberately. For that reason, because governments know that in order to steal your civil rights, you can't believe that those rights are being bestowed upon you by anyone except them. Therefore, they must subvert and they must undermine. Now, I'm going to end this stream very soon. Tate says, our rights come from God, not man, not a monarch, not a government. Quote from Robert Hurt. It's absolutely true. But before I end the stream, I want to just show you an example of a kind of thing. Okay. So, I mentioned philosophical materialists. New atheism died a death about a decade ago, and the new atheist figureheads, whether they be in real life or here on YouTube, they've kind of diminished, to say the least. But sometimes you end up interacting with one of these, what you might call atheist zealots, like it's still 2007, and that's what happened this week. So, on Twitter, I quoted Leonard Ravenhill was a preacher. He's dead now. He died, I think it was in 1994. But he was a great preacher. I really like him, and a lot of his sermons can be found on YouTube, although the quality is quite grainy because they're taken primarily, I think, from the 60s and the 70s. But this quote from Leonard here says, reading the Bible won't make you a saint, but if you get the Word of God in you and let it work out, it will. We've never had more Bible knowledge than we have now. Knowledge in itself is not experiencing God. And I said, notice how Ravenhill distinguishes between the Bible and the Word of God. It's because he recognized, as I explained in my book, that in the New Testament the Word of God is Yeshua himself. It's experience of the Spirit through Him that brings salvation, not a collection of texts. Now, I tweeted that, and in an instant, I got a response. A response from this guy. You may find this interesting. So I knew, because the response was so quick, I knew this was one of those spam things. Not that this guy's a bot. He's not a bot. It's just he's one of those guys he's one of those atheists who's constantly like looking up on Twitter. Someone mentioned the Bible, and as soon as someone mentions the Bible, regardless of what they're saying, he'll jump on and post his thing. That's the kind of thing. So, and that explains you see, if you look at my response, he says, you may find this interesting, and he shares this thread. And I said, I didn't, it's stupid. Now that sounds incredibly harsh. That's why I've got to explain to you the context that I knew this guy hadn't even read what my tweet had said. He just searched for Bible, seen that was a latest tweet with it, and he'd spammed his thread. And if you look at his Twitter account, that's what he does. He spams this thread over and over again. So let's have a look at this argument, because this guy created a thread claiming to have broken the Bible. And so I'm going to show you his argument to demonstrate how he didn't do that. But let's have a look at his argument. Okay, so he says, I broke the Bible. I call it the Christianity equation. Two sayings of Jesus that when put together negate belief in anything else the Bible has to say. Jesus was asked his opinion of what is the highest law. He gave two answers. Love your God with all your heart and love your neighbour as yourself. The highest law above all others. Sin is therefore defined as not loving your neighbour as yourself. Talking about sin, Jesus said that if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out, and if your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. Metaphor, if something of great importance causes you to sin, be rid of it. And nothing is of greater importance to a true believer than the beliefs they hold. If your beliefs cause you to not love your neighbour as yourself, you not only have the right to be rid of them, you have the responsibility to do so. Example, if your beliefs about homosexuality cause you to not love homosexuals as yourself, excise them. Get rid of what is said in Leviticus. And if there is even a single error in the Bible, then gasp, it isn't perfect. What else can be excised from Christian beliefs? The Christianity equation frees believers from the tyranny of their beliefs, allowing them to use their own critical faculties to shape themselves into people who love their neighbour as themselves, be excellent to each other. And it was the arrogance of this tweet in particular that really made me decide that I'm not gonna humour this guy for 2 seconds. The Christianity equation frees believers from the tyranny of their beliefs, allowing them to use their own critical faculties to shape themselves into people who love their neighbours as themselves, implying that Christians are all these, as atheists so often do, implying that these Christians are all these bigoted dummies just wandering around completely brainwashed. None of them are capable of thinking for themselves and so forth. Now, certainly if you've read my book, you'll know that I have many problems with organised religion. There are many what I call religionists out there that are very ignorant, and I will rail against all day long. But this is just typical of atheist arrogance. So that's why I took the tone that I did. Now, just in case you couldn't follow his canard there, don't worry, because I'm about to explain exactly what he was trying to do and what is wrong with that attempt. So he spams this to me, and I say, you may find this interesting. I say, I didn't, it's stupid. And he says, the words of Christ are stupid, really? And this is the thing about these people. This guy has nothing but contempt for the Bible. He has nothing but contempt for Christ. But what he's trying to do is weaponize those things against those who do view them as having some kind of authority. So I said, your assumption that Christians are mentally enslaved idiots is stupid. Maybe you were as one, but most aren't. Also ironic, since you spam your thread everywhere whether it's actually relevant or not. That's what you spend your time doing, so you're the enslaved one. And I wish he would appreciate my point there, because he's going around calling Christians enslaved. He's portraying them as stupid, brainwashed dummies. But if you look at this guy's Twitter activity, all he does day after day is spam that thread all over the place. So he talks about others being enslaved, but he wakes up every day with this compulsion, presumably fueled by some rage against religion or rage against God, to just invest his life in doing this. So who is more enslaved than him? It's like that meme you see where all these Christians are. No, it's like that meme where it's not necessarily about religion, but you've got a party and there's that guy standing in the corner, and all the people in the party are having fun, and the one guy in the corner is sitting there thinking to himself, "Man, if only these people knew, how great I am in all this way." It's like an outsider looking at people who are perfectly happy and content, and just being incapable of leaving them alone. So he says to me, "I'm pointing out the words of Christ. Do you disagree with them? Know better than them? I make no assumptions. I know Christians are taught that their beliefs must never be questioned. Christ says otherwise. Why does this offend you so much?" So, immediate gaslighting here. Why are you so offended? And by the way, Christ says otherwise. Christ never said otherwise to that. I didn't even bother pointing that out. Instead, I just said, "Well, I'm not a Christian, first of all, though I know the Bible better than you ever will. I know you know no such thing about them, because that isn't true. You've just created a petty caricature of them, because without that caricature, your points have no merit." He says, "Of course it's true. Millions upon millions, billions enslaved to their beliefs. That's how many religions work, specifically Christianity. You deny this? Not a Christian? Good for you. Know the Bible better than me? Irrelevant." And I say, yes, I deny it. Like I said, you're as enslaved as any religionist. Your whole life very clearly revolves around something you hate. And no, it's not irrelevant, because your whole canard depends upon you redefining sin as exclusively being two very specific things, which it isn't. So that's what he did. If we go back here, he says Jesus was asked his opinion. This is where he performs a sleight of hand, essentially, and it's upon this sleight of hand that his whole premise rests. Jesus was asked his opinion of what is the highest law. He gave two answers: love your God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself, the highest law above all others. Sin is therefore defined as not loving your neighbor as yourself. So see the leap in logic he made there? He talks about what Yeshua called the highest laws, and then he says, because of this, sin is therefore defined as these two things exclusively. It's again a sleight of hand that I guess some people didn't catch, but it makes no sense at all. So he says, awfully big and false assumptions you make. I don't understand this bit. Astounding mendacity to claim belief cannot be questioned in Christianity. I never claimed such a thing. Selfishness at the expense of others is the root of all evil. Another thing that's wrong in the Bible. That is the antithesis of the highest law, sin. So, on the one hand, he's trying to he's trying to weaponize the Bible's authority, but on the other hand, he's also saying that this is what's wrong in the Bible. So, which is it, And this is what it comes down to. Sin literally means to miss the mark, and there are many sins besides the two you highlight. You're sinning by denying Christ according to his own words, and nobody in the Bible talked about hell more than him. Funny how you trash the Bible, but try to weaponize select verses. And there's this classic meme here that says, you should let in more refugees because Jesus said to be compassionate in the Bible somewhere. No, I'm not a Christian, and I have nothing but contempt for your backwards religious beliefs. So yeah, this argument wouldn't work on me, but maybe if I use it on you, you'll do what I want. And that's what he was doing essentially. He is that guy in the meme. So, okay, there's something missing here. What, did he delete it, or? Yeah, he says, I didn't define two sins, I defined all sin, selfishness at the expense of others. I never trashed the Bible, I didn't weaponize verses. Well, as we've seen, he did both of those things. He said the Bible was wrong, and he's an atheist who has complete contempt for the Bible. You appear to engage in bibliolatry. I thought you were not bound by your beliefs. See, okay, I'll get to that in a moment. So, the ultimate point is this. I say, yes, that's right. You did define sin as selfishness at the expense of others because your entire thread depends upon that definition. But the definition is provably wrong because that's not the meaning of sin. Therefore, your thread falls apart in its first tweet. End of story. Now, Unlike a lot of people on Twitter, when I say end of story or I'm done with this, I really am done with it. So I didn't bother responding to his next thing. But I think he said, homosexuality is not missing the mark. The Bible says otherwise. Yet belief otherwise is why religious bigots use Leviticus to justify violations of the highest law. The Bible has errors. Oh wait, I thought you weren't trashing the Bible. The Bible has errors, moral, technical, historical. It's not worthy of bibliolatry. End of story. And while I came up with selfishness at the expense of others, not loving your neighbour as yourself as the antithesis of the highest law is defined by Christ, like as if I don't know the kind of convoluted logic he was using. That's besides the point. The point is that he tried to redefine what sin is, because if he didn't redefine what sin is, then the rest of his narrative makes no sense. What he did was he pointed to Jesus saying that the highest law is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbour as yourself. And then he played a sleight of hand so as to define not doing those things as being the very definition of sin itself, which is wrong. Sin, by definition, it literally means to miss the mark. So if you don't love God, you're sinning, you're missing the mark. If you don't love your neighbour, you're sinning, you're missing the mark. So to not do those things would certainly be sin. The sleight of hand is that he defines those two things as being the only two sins there are. That's not true. There are many sins besides those things, and as long as you recognise that and don't fall for his sleight of hand, the rest of his thread makes no sense whatsoever, because he's literally twisted the words of Yeshua to redefine sin in a way that is in a way that allows him to weaponize the Bible that he has nothing but contempt for against those who do view it as having some kind of authority. But the reason I showed you that exchange is because it's an example of something I talked about here, and it's something I see a lot, something a lot of you will see a lot. Now, where on earth did I say this in this book? I've got an idea of where I might have said it. Ah yes, it would have been in chapter 6, wouldn't it? But it's a great example of what I talked about there. Yes, here it is. Okay. There are some souls that are so utterly entrenched within their ideology, whether it is religious or secular, that they have become a prisoner of it and can no longer think outside of its confines. As a consequence, you may perceive when talking to them that they are not at all present in the conversation, but are instead passively running through a mental script. This phenomenon is most often seen among the adherents of particularly controlling cults, though it is far from exclusive to them. And that guy, and individuals like him, are a perfect example of that, where he is not speaking to me as an independent soul that could potentially have all manner of beliefs about all manner of things. The moment he sees me making a tweet that mentions the word Bible, he has already made all the assumptions in the world about me. He has already categorized me as a Christian, and he has caricatured Christians in his own mind as being exclusively ignorant, ill-educated bigots who are mentally enslaved by their religion. So because he assumes I'm a Christian, and because he views Christians that way, he views me that way. And so when he tries to engage with me, he can't engage with me as an independent soul. He can't engage with the points that I'm making. He can only engage with the caricature of a Christian that he has in his own head. That is something you see over and over again. That is what the Hylics of the Gnostics do. That is what the NPCs do. They run through a script when they think they're speaking to a certain kind of individual. And you see it all the time politically. If you express a view on Twitter that is typically understood to be just somewhat towards the right, you will have people on the left jump on you, assuming all manner of things about your other positions on things. By the way, this is why individuals on the left will throw around the words like buzz terms like racism so loosely. It's because they have the same kind of caricature about those on the right in their heads that guy had about Christians in his head. And so if you in some way demonstrate that you might be politically aligned in that direction, it's perfectly justified in their head for them to throw accusations of racist at you, even though you've shown no evidence of being prejudiced against people of a different skin color. But it's perfectly acceptable in their heads to do that, because again, all they're doing is they're running through a mental script, and they're not interacting with you as an individual soul. They are interacting with you as a caricature that exists primarily in their own heads. That's what's going on. Neurocraft says, secondarily, it also depends on the false identification of sin with the sinner, even though hate the sin, not the sinner, is almost a mantra in Christian circles. You know what? That's a great way to end this, because I don't want to... We must never lose sight of the fact that whenever we're interacting with other souls, whatever they're saying and however lowly their state might be, they are still just that, other souls. They are souls that are going through their own spiritual journey, their own process of development. And most souls in this world in human form have a hell of a long way to go. Most of them are going to end up in some hellish realm after the death of their mortal form, because they have such a long way to go. But that's the reason it is so important to remember that cliche: hate the sin and not the sinner, which, in case any of you don't know, is not actually a biblical verse. It's not in the Bible anywhere. I think it might have been. I think it was a nun that, I can't remember exactly. Maybe it was a nun that came up with it, but I'm sure it was a nun of some kind, a Catholic nun that came up with it at some point. I want to say it was Mother Teresa or Saint Teresa of Avila, but maybe not. But I'm sure it was a nun that came up with that. But it's important to remember, especially when we do live in this world and we are surrounded by not only so much evil, like in the form of our authoritarian politicians, but also surrounded by so many Hylics, so many NPCs that are just going along with it. And it can cause a lot of frustration to arise, because like I've seen this a lot recently, like on Twitter, and I don't mind being harsh with anyone. I'm not talking about not being harsh with people. Be as harsh with people as you like, as far as I'm concerned. Talk about that in the book as well. But for example, when we speak about authoritarian governments, when we speak about Austria mandating vaccines in February 2022, that is serious. That is something very, very serious in worldly terms. And yet, a lot of these NPCs, they're all treating it like a joke. It's funny to them, not because they necessarily actually find it funny, but because they enjoy kind of trolling those individuals that do take it seriously. So, despite how obviously serious it is, they'll just try and completely undermine anyone's efforts at making a serious point on the subject, just for the lulz, essentially. So, besides the evil authoritarians that are attempting this global coup right now, when you're also surrounded by obnoxious individuals like that, it's very necessary to remember, no matter how obnoxious they're being, and no matter how sometimes sinister they're being, how manipulative they're being in the way that they try to gaslight you, they are nothing more than ignorant souls. And one day, probably not in this lifetime, but in some lifetime in the future, they will get to a place where they see what they don't see now. But speaking for myself personally, I must repeat again, and this is what I'm going to end this particular stream with, as much as I do enjoy life, and if you know me in real life and if you watch these streams, you know I do enjoy life. I enjoy everything that I've been given the opportunity to do in this particular incarnation here in the material realm, I would dearly love it to be the last life I have here, because quite simply, and this should come as no surprise, I would rather spend an eternity with God than have any more lives here in the material realm. And I think most of us would feel that way. And a lot of philosophical materialists out there, they are fully, they are fully invested in the material realm. They love the material realm. They love everything they can do here. They would rather stay here, and so they will be back here after the death of their mortal form. But obviously, I don't feel that way, and I think that most individuals, most souls watching these streams don't feel that way. And so even though we don't seek to know God just so that we can escape from the material realm, it is an inevitable consequence of coming to know God, because when you come to know God, you know the perfection of God, you know the indescribable majesty of God, and even when I say those words, I think back to my past spiritual experiences. When you've even had so much of a taste of that, you know that nothing in this world, no matter how much you might enjoy life, nothing in this world can compare to that, and therefore you must seek for that pearl of great price. You must seek for that experience, so that after the death of your mortal form, you will abide in joy eternally. So, thank you very much for watching, everyone, and I will see you next time.